You thought history was boring? Well, ancient historians didn't think so. Fun history. Fun, weird, and without silly dates. Let's be brutally honest with each other, the way only two people who have just discovered they share the same embarrassing secret can be. When you picture a medieval peasant, let's call him Geoffrey the Slightly Damp, what do you see? You're probably not imagining a man who just stepped out of a steamy shower, smelling of sandalwood and bergamot, ready to spritz himself with a light, ocean-fresh mist. No, you're imagining a guy who looks like he just lost a prolonged and very personal fight with a mud puddle. You're picturing a man whose aroma can only be described as eau de cabbage and existential despair, and whose teeth have the color and consistency of old, discarded piano keys. And for the most part, you'd be right. But here's the kicker. The reasons behind Geoffrey's legendary stench are far more entertaining and significantly more tragic than simple, bone-deep laziness. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a sprawling, thousand-year stretch of human history where the concept of personal hygiene didn't just take a back seat. It was unceremoniously thrown out of the moving carriage, forced to hitch a ride with a passing pig, and was ultimately never seen or heard from again. This is a story not of apathy, but of a truly spectacular scientific blunder. It's a story about how a civilization, armed with a little bit of knowledge and a whole lot of fear, managed to turn a simple act of cleanliness into a one-way ticket to eternal damnation and, more immediately, a very itchy death. In the very early Middle Ages, believe it or not, bathing was actually quite popular. Monasteries, those bastions of prayer, silence, and really good beer, often had bathhouses. The lingering ghost of the Roman Empire, those legendary aqueduct builders and obsessive public bathers, meant that a good, honest soak was still considered a perfectly respectable activity. People understood that getting clean was, on some level, a good thing. But then, as the centuries rolled on, things got weird. Really spectacularly weird. By the late medieval period, the idea of a warm bath shifted from a healthy practice to a reckless invitation to the afterlife. So, what in the name of St. Swithin changed? In short, fear, superstition, and a total misunderstanding of microbiology that would make a modern fifth grader weep into their petri dish. Medieval medical science was a fascinating blend of ancient Greek texts, religious dogma, and the kind of creative thinking you usually only find in a fever dream. Its practitioners, often monks with a lot of free time and a deeply personal grudge against water, developed a theory about how the human body worked. It went something like this. Hot water opens your pores, and open pores, they reasoned, were essentially welcome mats for disease. Imagine the scene. It's 1348. The Black Death is sweeping through Europe, turning villages into ghost towns. You're a simple farmer. You've had a long day of, well, farming. Your wife suggests you heat up some water for a nice, relaxing bath to ease your aching muscles. And your response? Are you insane, woman? And turn myself into a death sponge? That's how you get the plague. That's how the plague gets you. This was the prevailing mindset. Water wasn't cleansing, it was treacherous. It could seep into those gaping, defenseless pores, weaken your body, and invite illness in through your skin like a virus slipping through an unlocked door on a hot summer night. Your skin wasn't a barrier, it was a colander. It didn't help that public bathhouses, the few that remained, developed a bit of a reputation. By the 13th and 14th centuries, these establishments had evolved from simple centers of hygiene into bustling social hubs with a rather scandalous side hustle. They became the Tinder of their day. The water wasn't the only thing getting steamy. A man might go in for a wash and come out with a new friend, a new rash, and a lighter purse. Some bathhouses became part spa, part brothel, offering extras that were definitely not approved by the local guild of bath attendants. The line between wellness and wink wink nudge nudge blurred faster than a monk's tonsure. Eventually the church, that eternal party pooper of the medieval era, decided it had seen enough. It looked at the giggling couples, the strategically placed loofahs, and the general air of ungodly merriment, and it drew a line in the sand. Public nudity, even when paired with the best intentions and a bar of lye soap, was a sin. And in medieval Europe, if the church wanted something shut down, it got shut down. Fast. So, the bathhouses were closed, their owners fined, and their patrons publicly shamed. The moral of the story? You can't spread sin through a public tub if the tub's been boarded up and declared a portal to hell by the local bishop. So instead of scrubbing down, people just stopped. Not because they loved being encrusted in a thick, protective layer of their own grime, but because staying dry was safer, holier, and frankly, more modest. After all, being naked in your own bed was one thing. It was practically a Christian duty to help repopulate Europe after all those plagues. But being naked in hot water with a few strangers? That was practically inviting the devil in for a splash and a loofah. And nobody wanted to be responsible for that. So, Geoffrey the slightly damp remained Geoffrey the downright funky, secure in the knowledge that his filth was a spiritual shield, a fragrant fortress against the forces of evil. He wasn't dirty, he was pious. He wasn't smelly, he was medically and theologically fragrant. So, we've established that the full-body immersion in a tub was, by the High Middle Ages, completely off the table. Unless you had a death wish, a sinful streak, or a truly unshakable desire to catch a demon. This leaves us with a rather pressing question. How, in the name of all that is holy and not completely rank, did medieval people manage the sheer, overwhelming, multi-layered reality of their own animal musk? How did they cope with the fact that their bodies were essentially walking, talking ecosystems, producing enough sweat and oil to power a small lamp? The answer is a fascinating and frankly ingenious mix of creative chemistry, strategic layering, and the kind of deep, profound denial that can only be achieved when everyone around you smells just as bad as you do. When a proper bath became medically suspect, the people of the Middle Ages didn't just give up and roll around in the mud. Instead, they turned to what we might call tactical hygiene. They perfected the art of the patch-up job. Enter the sponge bath. Except they didn't really have sponges. The humble sea sponge was a luxury import, not something your average turnip farmer had lying around. So they used what they had: linen cloths. They'd take a rag, soak it in a bit of warm water, vinegar, or a concoction of boiled herbs, and essentially try to buff themselves clean, as if they were painstakingly polishing a very smelly, very delicate piece of antique furniture. Hygiene became less about washing and more about strategic dabbing. You focused on the high-traffic areas: the hands, the face, the armpits, and maybe the feet if you were feeling particularly fancy, or if you were about to meet the king. It was like giving yourself a quick once-over with a single precious wet nap after a particularly messy barbecue. Except this particular barbecue lasted your entire life, and the napkin was made of your old bedsheet. Then there was the hair situation. Oh, the hair. If medieval hair had a motto, it would have been flammable but fragrant. They did wash it, just not with anything you'd find in a modern drugstore. Shampoo was still a fantastical dream, so they turned to home-brewed concoctions that sound less like hygiene products and more like the first draft of a wizard's spellbook. For the heavy-duty option, there was lye soap. This was a terrifying substance, made from wood ash and rendered animal fat. It was a miracle of chemistry. It was great at cutting through grease, but it was equally great at chemically exfoliating your scalp right down to the bone. It got you clean, but at a cost. It left you feeling raw, exposed, and questioning your life choices. For the more delicate souls, the gentler option was egg yolks. People would crack a few eggs over their heads and use the raw yolk as a cleanser. This meant sitting in a freezing stone hut with raw egg slowly sliding down your neck and into your ears, all while trying to convince yourself and anyone who was watching that this was nourishing and revitalizing. Others, in a moment of pure desperation, would rinse their hair with flat beer. This had the distinct advantage of making you smell like you'd had a wild night at the tavern, even if you were just trying to delouse and degrease in the privacy of your own hovel. But the true, unsung hero of medieval hygiene wasn't a liquid or a paste. It was a fabric: linen. Specifically, linen underwear. Linen undergarments were the undisputed most valuable players of the era. People wore long linen shirts, called shifts or chemises, directly against their skin, under their heavier, more expensive, and completely unwashable outer layers of wool and fur. The logic behind this was so elegant, so simple, it was practically genius. Wash the linen, not the person. Think of the linen shirt as a sacrifice, a disposable, or at least washable, barrier between the fragile, pore-covered human body and the expensive, tailor-made wool tunic that cost a small fortune. Because scrubbing your own skin could let the plague in, but scrubbing your shirt? Perfectly safe. People might go for weeks or even months without a full bath, but they would, if they were respectable, change their linen underlayer. Maybe once a week, maybe twice a month. It was a system. If your linen was relatively clean and white, you were considered a person of virtue and standing. If your linen was gray, crusty, and starting to move on its own, well, you were either poor, possessed, or had recently clawed your way out of a shallow grave. Linen was the original, all-natural, biodegradable Tide Pod. It absorbed the sweat, the grime, and the general human effluent, protecting the world from the full brunt of your personal ecosystem. And what about the face, the part of you that everyone could see? Dental care in the Middle Ages was less about achieving a sparkling Hollywood smile and more about the modest goal of, I still have most of my teeth, what's your excuse? The modern toothbrush was centuries away. Instead, people used their trusty linen rags. They'd rub their teeth with salt, crushed mint, or the ashes of burnt rosemary. The goal wasn't whitening, it was survival. If your breath was so bad it didn't make the horses in the stable rear back in terror, you were considered to be winning at oral hygiene. To freshen the breath between these intense rag-rubbing sessions, people chewed on fennel seeds or cloves. And if you had a toothache, you didn't call a dentist, you called a barber. Dentists were just barbers on their days off from cutting hair. If a tooth was infected, the solution was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly quick. Sit in this chair, open up, here comes a pair of pliers. No anesthetic, no whiskey, just a wooden chair, a very strong grip, and a few desperate prayers to a saint you were probably about to meet in person in about 5 minutes. Let's be really, deeply honest for a moment. Forget everything you've learned from romantic movies and fantasy novels. If you were to time travel to a bustling 14th century town square, your very first reaction wouldn't be awe at the Gothic architecture. It wouldn't be wonder at the strange clothing. It would be gagging. It would be the kind of smell that doesn't just enter your nose, but physically assaults you. It's a wall of funk, a putrid, palpable force that makes your eyes instantly water and your soul begin to question every single life choice that led you to this moment. There was no sewage system. Deodorant was a fantastical dream. And there was a deep, culturally ingrained suspicion of water. The average medieval street smelled like a hot, humid, and very crowded barn. It was a complex, multi-layered aroma, a symphony of filth with notes of sweat, rotting vegetables, livestock, and open sewers, all underpinned by a faint, desperate hum of blind optimism. It was, to put it mildly, an olfactory nightmare. So, how did the people who lived in this world cope? How did they function with this constant, inescapable assault on their senses? They got creative. They fought back the only way they could, with more smell. Enter the pomander. This was a small, hollow ball, often made of silver or gold for the rich, or just simple baked clay for the poor. People would fill it with a potent mixture of herbs and spices: cloves, cinnamon, lavender, musk. They'd wear it around their neck or tuck it into their clothing, using it as a kind of medieval, wearable Glade plug-in. The pomander was a tiny, fragrant warrior in a losing war. It didn't purify the air. It didn't eliminate the stench. It just politely and aggressively tried to overpower the filth with an even stronger but more pleasant smell. It was like putting a lavender-scented air freshener in a porta-potty. It helped, but you still knew exactly where you were. For the truly wealthy, the 1%ers of the feudal system, there was perfume. But not just any perfume. This was luxury goods, imported at great expense from the sophisticated distilleries of the Middle East. We're talking about real, high-class fragrances made from precious rose oil or from a substance called civet. Civet was a musky paste extracted from the perineal glands of a very surprised and likely very uncooperative cat-like animal from Africa. Think about that the next time you're admiring a knight's silk tunic. That sophisticated, manly scent he's wearing? It came from the rear end of a very stressed-out weasel. Applying this precious liquid was an art form. It involved dabbing it on pulse points, waving a handkerchief through the air, and trying very, very hard to pretend that you were not, in fact, just covering up the overwhelming smell of boiled cabbage, boiled leather, and boiled despair. Women braided sprigs of fresh herbs, rosemary, mint, sage, directly into their hair. This was a multitasking maneuver that was equal parts fashion statement, hygiene practice, and spiritual pest control. The herbs smelled nice, they were thought to ward off evil spirits, and they might even deter a few of the more adventurous lice. It was a fragrant and slightly itchy shield against the world. But you couldn't just rely on accessories to mask the stench. You had to actively manage the source, your own body. Deodorant, as we know it, did not exist. There were no roll-ons, no sprays, no clinical-strength aluminum compounds designed to seal your sweat glands in a terrifying but effective chemical embrace. No, medieval people just sweated, and they made a profound peace with it. Some used alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt with mild antibacterial properties. It didn't stop the sweat, but it could, in theory, cut down on the smell produced by the bacteria that lived in it. This, however, required you to grind up a rock and shove the resulting powder into your armpits, which takes a certain kind of commitment. Others used chalk or wiped themselves down with vinegar-soaked rags. The simple, underlying logic was this: if you can't stop the funk, at least try to smell like a salad. This brings us to the great, unspoken truth of the era: the democracy of stench. You were not alone in your unique personal aroma. Everyone, and I mean everyone, smelled. The king in his castle, sweating under all that velvet and fur, he smelled. The pious monk, flagellating himself in a cold monastery, he had his own special bouquet. The blacksmith, the baker, the candlestick maker, the beautiful maiden at the well, they all had their own distinct and likely potent brand of body odor, lovingly cultivated over a lifetime of strategic water avoidance. It was a truly democratic, non-discriminatory aroma. And thanks to the fashion of the day, heavy, multi-layered tunics made of wool and fur that acted like a personal, portable greenhouse, that wonderful aroma was trapped, slow-cooked against the skin, and amplified to perfection throughout the day. It wasn't just body odor, it was a lifestyle, it was a statement. And if you were wondering, yes, there were also lice. So many lice. They were the true equalizers of medieval society. They didn't care about your social status, your piety, or your personal wealth. They were the uninvited and utterly inescapable roommates that absolutely everyone had. People used fine-toothed combs made of bone to literally rake the little screaming hitchhikers off their scalps. They'd boil their clothes or hold them dangerously close to an open flame for a mass, fiery execution of the pests. It wasn't laundry day, it was pest control day. Some monks just gave up and shaved their heads entirely. It was a dramatic but undeniably effective solution. After all, if there's no hair, there's no home for the vermin. Now, after all that talk of smells, rags, and pest control, we have to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the decidedly less majestic but equally important matter of what the elephant leaves in the room. In a world that smelled like a poorly maintained barn, what did the bathrooms look like? What was the state of the art in medieval plumbing and poop management? Surprisingly, the concept of a dedicated toilet existed, but its execution was, shall we say, rustic. For the elite, living in their drafty stone castles, the height of sanitary engineering was the garderobe. This was essentially a small closet-like room, built into the thickness of the outer wall. Inside, there was a simple stone bench with a hole in it. And this hole led to a long chute that dropped straight down the side of the castle, often emptying directly into the moat below. It was simple, gravity-powered, and brutally efficient. It did, however, create a few minor issues. If you were standing guard below, you learned very quickly not to look up and not to linger in any one spot for too long. The moat, meanwhile, became less of a scenic body of water and more of a slowly circulating, chunky soup. It was the ultimate moat defense system. Not even the most determined attacker would want to wade through that. For the common folk, living in their crowded villages and timber-framed houses, things were far less architectural. Most people just went outside. The world was their oyster, and their oyster was also their toilet. They'd wander into the woods, pop behind the barn, or just find a quiet spot in the field where they happened to be standing when nature called. Some slightly more organized villages had communal cesspits, which were essentially large holes in the ground surrounded by a flimsy wooden hut. These were the original outhouses, and they came with very low standards and even less privacy. You could find yourself squatting right next to your neighbor, engaged in a lively philosophical debate about the price of grain, while both of you were simultaneously contributing to the ever-growing community pile in the pit below. It was a bonding experience, if nothing else. But the true star of the medieval sanitation show was the humble chamber pot. These were simple ceramic bowls, kept tucked under beds or in small cupboards, ready for those urgent, middle-of-the-night emergencies when the trek to the woods was just too far and too dark. The chamber pot was a trusted friend in the dark hours. But the real fun began the next morning. The sun would rise, and the people of the house would be faced with a pot full of the previous night's activities. So, what did they do with it? Why, they threw it out the window, of course. But, being the remarkably considerate and public-spirited folks they were, they didn't just hurl it without warning. Oh no. They would first stick their head out the window, check for passers-by, and then give a hearty, traditional shout of Gardyloo. This was a corruption of the French phrase "regardez l'eau," which charmingly translates to "watch out for the water." A few seconds later, the contents of the pot would come raining down into the street below. Accuracy, as you might imagine, was not guaranteed. Street sanitation, therefore, was handled mostly by gravity, by the pigs and dogs that roamed freely and ate anything, and by the fervent, lifelong hope that you weren't standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Given this chaotic, waste-filled reality, it's a miracle that public bathhouses ever existed at all. But they did, and for a glorious, if brief period, they were the social hubs of medieval Europe. Inspired by the lingering memory of the Romans, These establishments offered a wide range of services. For a few coins, you could get a hot bath, a steam in the sauna, a massage, a hot meal, and live music. Think of them as the original medieval day spas, but with more nudity, more gossip, and significantly fewer cucumbers for your eyes. But, as we've learned throughout this journey, the good times in the Middle Ages never lasted. By the 13th century, bathhouses had acquired a reputation for what we might call aggressive multitasking. They became places where you could get your back scrubbed and other things. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't just common, it was expected. Some bathhouses became de facto brothels with really good plumbing. The water got hot, and not just from the fire beneath the tubs. The church, ever watchful and ever disapproving, was naturally horrified. They looked at the giggling, naked masses and declared that this was a one-way ticket to Sin City. They warned that bathing in mixed company led to immorality, which, to be fair, it often did. And then came the Black Death. When the plague arrived, killing millions, everyone started looking for a scapegoat. And those fun, sinful, steamy bathhouses were the perfect target. The learned doctors of the day pointed to their trusty open pores theory and declared, "Aha! We knew it! Warm baths open the pores, and open pores let in disease." The logic was inescapable, if you had absolutely no understanding of germs. The bathhouses were shut down, their reputations destroyed, and their doors nailed shut. And with them went the last, best hope for public hygiene in medieval Europe. The people were sent back to their chambers pots, their vinegar rags, and their damp, lonely existences, waiting for the sweet release of death, or at least for someone to finally invent a working toilet. So there we were, in medieval Europe, a continent of people dabbing at their pits with vinegar and perfecting the art of the Gardyloo toss, all while living in a cloud of their own making. It was a low point in the history of human hygiene. But while they were busy regressing, other civilizations, long since turned to dust, were laughing at them from beyond the grave. Because centuries, and in some cases millennia, before the first chamber pot was ever launched from a Parisian window, other cultures had already cracked the code of urban sanitation. They had figured it out, and their achievements are enough to make a medieval knight spit out his, probably pretty dirty, mead in a fit of jealous, stinking rage. Let's take a trip back in time, way back, to about 2500 BCE. We're in the Indus Valley, in a city called Mohenjo-Daro. Now, if you were expecting a few dusty mud brick huts clustered around a well, you would be in for a shock. This place was more organized, more clean, and more advanced than most European cities would be for another 4,000 years. It was laid out on a strict, precise grid pattern, with wide, straight streets running at perfect right angles. It was as if the ancient architects had been given a ruler, a theodolite, and a very strict mandate and had said, "Let's keep this thing geometric, people, no funny business." But the real magic, the thing that would make a medieval mayor weep with envy, was happening underground. Mohenjo-Daro had a sewer system, a real, working, municipal sewer system. Almost every single house in the city, from the largest mansion to the smallest worker's cottage, had access to clean water and a drainage system. Wastewater from household bathrooms and kitchens would flow through terracotta pipes into covered drains that ran along the length of every major street. And these weren't just open ditches. They were covered drains, lined with carefully fitted bricks. And they even had manholes and access points so they could be cleaned out when they got clogged. Let that sink in for a moment, preferably while you're sitting on your own modern porcelain throne. While the ancestors of the French were perfecting the art of throwing poop out the window, these Bronze Age folks in Pakistan had indoor plumbing. They had private wells in their courtyards and toilets connected to a citywide sewage system. They had public baths, including the famous Great Bath, a massive, watertight, brick-lined pool that was likely used for some form of ritual purification. It was a city built with intent, with intelligence, and with the radical, world-changing idea that sanitation and public health were actually kind of important. And they did it all without a single HOA meeting. Now, let's travel west to the glittering, mythical city of Babylon. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a superstar, a celebrity. At its peak, around 600 BCE, it was the dazzling, jeweled heart of Mesopotamia. It was a massive, walled city, protected by fortifications so thick that a chariot could, allegedly, drive on top of them. The main entrance was the Ishtar Gate, a towering structure covered in brilliant, glazed blue bricks, adorned with rows of golden dragons and sacred bulls. It looked like something out of a fever dream. At the city's heart was a sacred processional way, a grand boulevard designed for religious parades and state ceremonies. The temples and palaces of the gods and the king dominated the city center, while the common people and their grubby market stalls were pushed out towards the edges. It was urban planning as propaganda, a constant, inescapable reminder of who was in charge. They had drainage too, with clay pipes and brick-lined canals carrying water and waste away from the fancier neighborhoods. It wasn't the universal access of the Indus Valley, but it was still a level of engineering that medieval Europe couldn't even dream of. Finally, let's jump forward in time and hop across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Around 500 CE, in what is now Mexico, there was a city called Teotihuacan. At its peak, it was one of the largest cities on the entire planet, with a population of well over 100,000 people. Its main street was the Avenue of the Dead, a vast 2-mile-long boulevard flanked by massive step pyramids, including the pyramids of the Sun and the Moon. The whole city was laid out on a precise, astronomically aligned grid. Every street, every plaza, every temple was positioned to align with the movements of the stars and planets. It wasn't random, it was cosmological. It was urban planning as a sacred act. And like the others, Teotihuacan had a sophisticated water management system. They built canals and drains alongside the streets to control storm runoff and prevent flooding in the rainy season. They understood their environment and they planned for it. The city was divided into distinct residential compounds, each housing multiple families. These compounds were laid out in a modular block system, and many had their own drainage systems and shared patio spaces. Some neighborhoods were even dedicated to immigrants from other cultures, who were allowed to build their homes in the architectural style of their faraway homelands. It was zoning, multiculturalism, and cosmic alignment, all happening in one city 1,500 years ago. These three ancient civilizations understood what the medieval Europeans had forgotten: that a city is more than just a random collection of huts. It's a living organism that needs to be designed, managed, and above all, kept clean. They had zoning laws. They had sanitation systems. They had a philosophy of urban living. They knew that a little bit of planning could save you from the ultimate indignity of living and dying in your own filth. They were the secret sanitation superstars of the ancient world, and they left behind a legacy that would put the entire Middle Ages to shame. So, after 6,000 words of scratching, sniffing, strategic dabbing, and narrowly dodging airborne waste, we have arrived at the final, the ultimate, the only question that truly matters. After all that, after the lye soap, the beer rinses, the flea executions, and the Gardyloo warnings, did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneously combusting in a puff of their own, well, everything? The short answer, and the one that will allow you to sleep tonight, is it worked well enough. Not by our standards, of course. Let's be very clear about that. If you were to time travel back to the year 1347, your nose would immediately pack its bags, file for a divorce from your face, and move to a less smelly dimension. Your skin would start itching in sympathetic terror the moment you arrived. You would be miserable, overwhelmed, and deeply, profoundly confused. But in their own context, within their own strange, water-fearing, pore-obsessed world, medieval people weren't completely oblivious to the concept of cleanliness. They weren't wallowing in their own filth for fun. They had a system. It was just a very different system from ours, based on a completely different set of priorities that were, let's be generous, incredibly fluid. They had tools, meticulously carved lice combs, layers of clean, or at least cleaner, linen, jars of vinegar, bunches of dried herbs, and bars of terrifyingly harsh lye soap that could strip the hide off a cow. They had rituals, the Saturday night sponge bath before Sunday Mass, the seasonal boiling of the entire family's underwear, and the daily, hopeful application of fragrant herbs. They had a philosophy, and it was this: clean clothes are far more important than a clean body. A bright, relatively fresh-smelling linen shift was a clear sign of virtue and social standing. It told the world that you had your life together, even if the body underneath hadn't seen a drop of water since the last total eclipse of the sun. The linen was your hygiene. The linen was your shield. In many ways, they were doing the best they could with the incredibly limited tools and the spectacularly bad information they had been given. They were constantly trying to balance their own desire for comfort with the overwhelming need to not accidentally anger God, annoy the local baron, or personally offend their own armpits. The idea of a full-body bath was, to them, a genuinely risky proposition. It was time-consuming, logistically difficult, and, according to every authority figure they had, medically unwise. So, they got inventive. The linen underwear strategy was a genuinely smart and effective piece of hygiene engineering. The use of herbal and vinegar rinses had real, if accidental, antibacterial logic behind it. Even the communal bathhouses were a fantastic idea, a wonderful combination of public health and social gathering, right up until they turned into syphilis-spreading, sin-encouraging hot tubs of ill repute. But let's not sugarcoat it. Yes, they smelled. They scratched, constantly and publicly. They shared their baths, their beds, their lice, and their utterly disastrous medical advice. And yet, here's the truly remarkable part. Many of them lived to see old age. They survived. They had children. They built magnificent cathedrals. They fought wars. They created art and literature. They did all of this while being, by our standards, absolutely nose-bleedingly filthy. Their standards were low, but so was the bar. They had no point of comparison. In a world where everyone around you has the same background aroma of wood smoke, sweat, and boiled cabbage, you don't even notice it anymore. It just becomes the smell of home. And let's be fair, in at least one way, they were healthier than us. Their diet was almost entirely devoid of processed sugar. They might have been dirty, but their teeth were often in far better shape than those of a modern teenager mainlining soda and candy. The lack of sugar meant less tooth decay. So, Geoffrey the downright funky might have had breath that could fell an ox, but the teeth underneath that foul cloud were probably pretty solid. So, did medieval hygiene work? It worked in the same way that keeping a wheel on a speeding wagon with a single, frayed piece of twine works. It was a system held together by hope, habit, and a profound lack of alternatives. It was barely functional, held together by sheer willpower and a healthy dose of denial, but it was impressively resilient given the circumstances. It was a system built on a foundation of faulty science, religious paranoia, and a whole lot of communal suffering. It wasn't good, it wasn't pleasant, but it was theirs. And in the end, it served its purpose. They got by. They survived the plagues, the famines, and the wars. They passed on their genes, their stories, and their strange, elaborate methods for dealing with lice. And eventually, centuries later, their descendants figured out that bathing was, in fact, not a direct portal to hell. It just took them a few hundred years of scratching and stinking to work up the courage to finally, hesitantly, turn on the tap again.